Hello and welcome back to the Virtual My YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about identity. We're going to install Active Directory Domain Services from scratch. Active Directory Domain Services is the underpinning of every corporate environment that you've worked in. And today we're going to show you how you would deploy that as if you're doing a fresh deployment. And then what we're going to be doing in future videos, we're actually going to be underpinning that and actually show you how to sync that with Entra ID and configure single sign-on. So think about this series as identity focused, where we're going to go some deep dives and we'll look at group policies, we'll look at Intune policies, and how we can manage those devices, whether those devices are on-prem or whether they sit inside your environment as well. So it's going to be a really good series of videos, something which a lot of people don't get to do from scratch. So I'll walk you through that whole process as well. All right. As I mentioned, today's video is going to be focusing on the underpinning of that. We're going to install the 2025 operating system and Active Directory Domain Services. And then once we've done that, we're going to do a quick explore around the console. We're going to show you group policies, DNS, that kind of thing. And then we'll actually add a workstation to the domain. We'll create a group policy setting. We'll show how that group policy setting is applied. And then we'll leave it there for today's video. In the next video, I'll show you how to sync that up to Entra ID, do all that synchronization and show you how all that stuff works as well. And the user objects replicated. Well, really looking forward to these series of videos. I used to like Active Directory for flight support. I'm looking forward to revisiting that subject. I can learn as well. And I'm going to teach you. All right, so let's actually get into it. And now we're going to go ahead. We're going to install Active Directory on our server 2012 operating system. If you want to see how we install the operating system, check my previous video. I'll go into a bit more detail on that. But for this video, we're going to focus on getting Active Directory set up, getting DNS set up, create a group policy, add to the domain, test it. Okay. All right, let's get started. All right, so I've built a domain controller, the operating system for the domain controller. We're actually going to convert it. So yes, we just take a step back. What is a domain controller? Essentially, Active Directory is a database. It is a database of your users, your group policy settings, and a domain controller is the server, which basically runs. When we create Active Directory, we're going to create an Active Directory database, and that's where all your users would sit in, and it creates something called a sysvol. So that's where a lot of the domain stuff is shared. Okay, let's go on to this. There's a few things that we need to do first, because the most important thing around Active Directory is actually DNS, right? And we need to make sure we can do something called name resolution. So we're going to give the domain controller a static IP address. So normally in a environment, you create that a DHCP reserved IP address. Let's actually go ahead and have a look at this. I can see here I've got no internet access on my VM. I've created a private switch within Hyper-V. This is going to be segregated network. So we're going to configure this local server. First, we need to change the computer name to DC1, the member of a work group for now, because we don't have a domain. Okay, just going to set that, close. We're not going to restart it yet, because there's a few other things that I want to change as well. We can see here the IP address signed by DHCP. So I'm going to change that and give it a static IP address. So properties, use 192.168.0.1. Default gateway, I'm not going to set one for now. Preferred DNS server. When you run Active Directory, you need to have its own DNS server. For now, I'm going to select this to itself. Okay, I'm going to click close for that. So that's giving it a static IP address. And then we're also going to just switch the phone as well, because we're in the UK. And then click on that. Yep. Okay, cool. Let's double check to make sure that's actually working. Deconfig. Yep. So that's now our static IP address. Okay. Awesome. So now I'm just going to give that a restart. So yeah, continue. Okay. So we've changed the computer name. We've given it a static IP address, and we've configured the DNS setting to put it. Okay. And now we're actually going to go ahead and promote this to a domain controller. Okay. All right. So we're going to go to configure this local server. Okay. So you can see here it's workgroup name local. So DC1 workgroup. We're in the correct time zone. Okay, and it's the correct time. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the dashboard, and then we're going to go to add a role, right? Because we need to add to the domain controller role. So we're going to go to here, role-based or feature-based installation. Okay. Select a server from the pool, DC1. Click next. This is where we need to select the roles. So we're going to select Active Directory domain services. Okay. It's going to install the management tools that we need to manage this environment. So it's going to install something called the RSAT tools. So the RSAT tools is the remote server administration tools, and the tools which it needs to manage Active Directory. So if you wanted to, you could actually, when it's recommended, to install these on a separate machine. So you don't have to keep logging on to the domain controller. We're just going to add these for now. Going to add features for Active Directory certificate services. If you needed to do sort of certificate management for your environment, Directory Federation services, that's something called ADFS. People don't really use that much anymore, but some places they do. Active Directory lightweight directory services. So this is something which some applications use. And then we can use something called Active Directory rights management service as well, which we'll go into. All right, so we're just going to use the Active Directory domain services, but I'm also going to do DNS server, right? Because we need a DNS server. Just going to select that as well, because this is also going to be the DNS server. So I'm going to click that. Okay, so we've got Active Directory, got DNS server. Don't think we need anything else. So we're just going to select next. It's asking me any other features that we need, which we don't. So I'm just going to select next. Active Directory domain services. Okay. So I'm going to select next. So that's asking us about the DNS stuff. So we're just going to click next for that as well. All right. So we're going to tick the restart if needed. So it's basically going to give us a summary of what we're installing here. We're installing Active Directory domain services. We're installing the DNS server. We're installing group policy management so we can manage group policies. And we're installing the RSAT tools and that we can use to manage. Well, so I'm just going to click on the install button, and that's going to kick off the installation. So we'll let that go through, and we'll be back shortly. Okay, so it says configuration required. Installation succeeded. So now we're going to select promote this to a domain controller, right? So it's installed all the roles. So now we just need to promote it. So I'm just going to click this. Okay. If you were installing an existing domain controller with Active Directory, you can have multiple domain controllers for redundancy. It's also advisable to have a domain controller in each of those locations, and because you're going to have secure authentication traffic going across the network. So for better performance, you want to make sure the domain controller is located as close to your workstations as possible. Okay. All right. So in a Azure Virtual Desktop environment or a Windows 365 environment, for example, you'd probably have a domain controller inside your Azure subscription. You don't want that authentication traffic going over the network. You want to keep it local. We control that via something called Active Directory Sites and Services. I'm going to basically add a new forest, right? I can add a new domain to an existing forest, which we don't want to do because we don't have a forest. So what we're going to do is add a new forest, right? I'm going to call this virtualmic.local. Okay, so virtualmic.local. Next. Now we need to select the forest function level. We're installed on Windows Server 2025, so it would only let us select that. These are quite important. Domain function levels and forest function levels are something which modifies something called the schema. And when you upgrade Active Directory, for example, when you go from 2008 to 2012 and then 2012 to 2019, etc., it builds different domain function levels and forest function levels. And that's basically adding the new features as part of what we call the schema. Now, you need to be really careful about these schemas because they can break your environment completely. So when updating stuff, people are very cautious. Normally, they don't like to update it unless they need to. But I will always recommend upgrading to the latest schema if you can, or the domain functional forest levels. So we're just going to select the Windows Server 2025, which will give you all the new features that you get with Active Directory services. We're going to install something called a DNS server. So the DNS server is responsible for converting an IP address into a name and vice versa. Okay. We're going to install something called a global catalog. So global catalog, again, is something which you need in every environment. It has a certain number of actions. You need a global catalog in your environment as well. That's really key. And then you can also do something called read-only domain controllers. They're important in secure environments. If you don't want anybody to hack into your domain controller and start writing stuff, a read-only domain controller contains a read-only version of the Active Directory database. So if you've got a branch office where people have physical access to domain controllers and you don't want them to get onto the server and start doing stuff to the database, we can create a read-only domain controller. What that means, it means that those are secure, right? So if someone gets onto it, they can't modify anything to your database. And it's quite useful as well for more security bases as well. Okay. So we're not going to select a read-only domain controller here, but we are going to select something called a directory services restore mode. So this is basically if we get locked out of Active Directory, how can we get back in there? We can actually restore the database. And to restore the database, you need to set something called a directory services restore mode. If the database gets corrupt or something, and we need to do a restore, and we need this. So if you do set this, make sure you put it in a secure place somewhere and write it down. We're going to select next, specify DNS delegation options. I don't need to do this. So it's saying that here because a private zone cannot be found. We had multiple DNS zones. We probably want to do this, but we don't here. So select next. Verify the NetBIOS name. NetBIOS is something which is legacy. Before we had Active Directory, we had to be called NetBIOS. So that's just the short name we're going to have for that. We're just going to select that as virtual mount. The paths, it's going to ask me what the paths are for the database. This is where it's going to hold the NTDS database, which is essentially the Active Directory database. Then we also have something called the sysvol. So the sysvol is something which replicates like logon scripts and GPO settings. So in a corporate or large environment, you'd probably stick these on a separate disk. You may have a D drive or an E drive or something. But for this environment, because we're quite small, we're just going to select all locations. It's just asking us to review those settings. So I'm just going to say yes to those. And then next. Okay, so it's just looking at the prereqs and making sure that we have everything in place here, which we should do. It's complete successfully. Click install to begin installation. All right, I'm going to select next, install, and off it will go and start to install the Active Directory services. Okay, so the machine is rebooted. So let's just log on. I'm going to log on as administrator. So because this is now a domain controller, it doesn't actually have any local accounts anymore. So we're logging onto the virtualmank.local domain. All right, let's have a quick check now. So we just launch up Server Manager. Yeah, close this down. Don't show that again, please. Okay. All right, we are now installed. Let's have a quick look and see what we've got here. So I go to All Apps, have a look at our tools. If I go to using computers, these are the tools we use to manage Active Directory, right? So if I go to Active Directory users and computers, that should load up, and you can see here we've got the virtualmank.local domain. This is what's been installed. I'll just quickly show you as well. If I go to those, we should be able to see the folder that it created. It's created the sysvol folder there that you can see. And this is the NTDS folder, contains the Active Directory database. And this folder is actually ntds.dip. So believe it or not, that is the Active Directory database. It'll be one of the most important files in your whole of your environment, right? So ntds.dip. So that's what the database actually is. Okay. All right, so here we can go in, we can go users, and this is where we could create our users. And then we have something called OUs. Right? An OU is like a logical group. We'd have stuff. I can create one here. If I go to create an OU, got in here, I can put user objects, user accounts, groups, and also computer objects as well, right? So I can basically create a user called Bob, for example. So let's create a user called Bob Smith. His user logon name is going to be Bob Smith at versionmac.local. And we'll actually use this as a test as well when we add our workstations domain. All right, so I'm going to create him as and then yeah, I'm going to not ask him to change it, but if you wanted to force him to, this is where you'd set that. I'm just going to set this because this is my test environment. Obviously, a production environment, you would never do that. So I'm going to select next and then just going to select finish. Okay, we have our user called Bob Smith in the OU called testing, right? We just created a user account. And we could do the same thing for groups, right? So if I wanted to create a group, call this as okay, create that. So now I've created a group. So we've now got a security group and a user. And then I can add Bob into that group if I wanted to. So we're going to go to add and then select Bob. Nicknames, Bob Smith. Okay. Bob is now a member of that test group. Okay. So now let's go and look at the group policies, right? I go into here, type in group policy management. Group policy is something you use to manage the configuration settings inside your environment. We'll start to look at in-tune policy settings and look at how different they are. But for here, we'll just basically do some group policy stuff because that's probably what most people used to do. So we have a default domain controllers policy, and we also have a default domain policy. These are the default settings which are applied to everyone. You should never change any settings in here, right? So we should never edit the default policy. Yeah, so you can see here, these are just different settings which are configured by default. Normally what we do, we create like baseline settings. So for example, I can go here. So let's create a group policy and apply it to our testing OU, right? I'm going to go create a GPO and link it here. Okay, so we're going to call this test GPO. When we have group policies, we have two types, computer and user settings. For this one, I'm just going to do a computer setting. Within the policies is how we control stuff. We can do logon scripts, startup scripts, control the control panel, prevent lock screens. We can do it. There's literally thousands of settings, so I'm not going to go through some of these, but we're just going to configure something. And then when we add our workstations domain, I'll show you how that applies as well. So we're going to turn off all toast notifications. I go into here and select that enabled. There we go. We've now configured a group policy setting, which will turn off all the notifications. And if I close that down and go to this test GPO, we can see what settings have been configured. We can see in here, this is going to apply to everything in this OU. You can see the settings configured for this as well. All right, I'm going to build another OS, add that OS to the domain, and log on as Bob, and then we're going to test and just make sure that has actually been applied. Okay, see you shortly. Okay, we are back. I've created a client. We're just going to log into this. This is Bob. Everyone, me Bob. So we're going to sign in. The first thing I need to do is change the IP address settings because I want to point the DNS settings to the DNS server. Yeah. In the corporate environment, this will be handled by DHCP, but I don't have a DHCP server in my lab environment. So essentially, what we're going to do, we're just going to change the network settings. This VM. So settings, and then we are network and internet. So this is the Ethernet connection we want to change. It's currently set to DHCP. I'll click on the edit button. Manual before on. The address is going to be 1.18.0.5. Call it. The mask is 255, 250. Gateway, we have one. So this is where we point to our domain controller. Okay, so she's running our DNS. So I'm basically going to say 192.168.1. Let's just double check that's the IP address of our main controller. Connect to that. On it's right. Config. So this is our domain controller. So 192.168.0.1. The IP address for the client is going to be 192.168.0.5. Okay. All right. So I'm going to set the DNS server to 192.168.0.1, which is what we've got our domain controller, and I'm just going to save that. Okay. So that means we should now have a connection between the two. Okay. So let's test that and make sure we can actually communicate. Ping 192.168.0.1. Okay, we're getting a response. Now, the most important thing is that I can ping the name of the domain. So, it's going to ping virtualbank.local. Okay, so that's good. That means it's basically resolving virtualbank.local to 192.168.0.1, which is the DNS server. Okay, so now we're sounding locally on the workstation to call Bob. This is the local desktop, and it's called Bob. We're going to add this workstation to the domain. Okay, and then we go to domain or workgroup. So this is where we're going to add it to the domain. Okay, to rename a computer or change the domain, go to change. Then I'm going to type in the name of the domain. It's going to be virtual bank. Cool. Click on OK. It's going to ask us for the domain name. Type in. So this is the account that we initially created on the domain controller. Okay. Okay, so that's all working. So once you get this, you know you've contacted the domain and you've got the correct permissions. Okay, click on OK. All right, so we're going to click close to that, and then that's actually going to restart that device. You can log on as our domain account we created earlier. Right. Okay, so now let's try and log in as Bob Smith. So I'm going to go to username, Bob Smith. You can either enter the username as Bob Smith or the full VPN. So that's going to be Bob Smith at virtualbank.local. Password is I configured earlier. Okay. So now we're just logged in with Bob Smith. Okay. So this is the domain account. So we logged on to the domain. We're not logged on locally. We're logged on to the domain account. So this is obviously the first time that Bob has logged in. It's going to take a few minutes to configure settings. Here we are. So what we can do now is double check who we are. Command prompt and type in who am I. Right. That tells me I'm Virtual Bank and my name is Bob Smith. Now we can say, okay, do you remember we created that group policy? So let's have a quick check and see whether that group policy setting has actually applied. For that, I use a command called gp result. So gp result r scope computer. It's denied. Okay, so I don't have admin permissions. Bob doesn't actually have administrative permissions, right? Bob is just a normal user. What I need to do now is enter my main admin credentials. Okay. Now if I just do that again, so gp result / r scope compute. It's basically telling me this is the domain. So you can see it's added here, the computer objects, it's telling me what group policies have been applied. And you can see here it says apply group policy, just default domain policy. Why is that? It's probably because this is just the first time that we've logged on, right? So we need to make sure that we do the GP update / force. Sometimes it takes a couple of reboots for settings to apply. Let's have a quick look and see that's the difference. I'm just going to give that machine a reboot. This group policy hasn't applied because it's in the computers OU, right? I need to log on to the domain and then change the OU. If I go back onto the main controller, go to my computers, I can see this dashboard object here. This is the computer object which is created. Now we need to move that object to the computers OU. Right? So I'm going to move that into there. So testing. Yep. And now if we go to testing, we can see that this computer object is now there. Right? Because we configure the group policy to apply to everything within the OU. So now we need to go back onto Bob. So let's go to Bob to restart a computer. There we go. Log in as Bob Smith again. Let's check again to see whether the policy is applied. I'm just going to run this administrator. EP. Oh. Okay. So now we can see we're in the testing OU. There we say apply group policy objects test GPO. All right. So we have deployed a domain controller. We have created a user account. We've added a workstation to the domain, and then we logged on with the policy that. So that's pretty much all you have to do. It's quite simple. Obviously, there's more advanced stuff that you can do with Active Directory, but that's just basics to get you started. So as I mentioned, I'm probably going to do a bit of a series on this. Then we'll maybe go a bit deeper into Active Directory policy. But in the next video, I'm going to show you how to sync Bob into Entra ID. If Bob wants to log on to an Entra only account, or we need to create an account for Bob in Entra ID, how to. So, hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you. Bye.